friend said, "या तुम वो as I said, caste genetics पे बात करो." And simply in a spirit of perversity, let me not talk about that, but talk about something going a little bit further back, a few tens of thousands of years further back. And let us talk about what biologically, for our broad species group, ideas of diversity and unity have meant. So think about the human genome sequencing. What the world community of life scientists did almost 20 years ago now is sequenced the human genome. But there is no such thing as the human genome. Because if you say the human genome, that's a singularity, that's a unity, that's one thing. And if you look at ourselves, we're clearly not one thing, we're not copies. So, what are the sources of this immense diversity? Simply appearances that we have. So there's all this argument about nature and nurture, which we will get into it later if time permits. But the problem with the human genome as an idea, at its core is this: there is no such thing. There is an approximation. Somebody has put together a group of sequences of DNA from one person. Actually, from if there are biologists here, they will remind me of 3 people or 4 people. But a mixture of 3 or 4 people, DNA from a mixture of 3 or 4 people was sequenced. And what we are looking at as the human genome is actually an approximate guess at best. We've done better simply by virtue of technology, and therefore the approximation has become less and less and less, sure, but it's still an approximation. One of the consequences of that sequencing and of the sequencing and other ways of identifying genetic differences between individuals that have grown up out of that process has been a fair amount of support for the out of Africa hypothesis that has been in the limelight for many years now as the explanation for the origins of humanity. And the argument there is that as a species, we came out of Africa whether before the Sumatran volcano erupted or a little bit before and a little bit after is still open to question and debate, but we did. We came out of Africa and we migrated here, there, everywhere, and our argument therefore has been most dramatically posited in old hyperbole in the pages of scientific journals about identifying Eve, identifying Adam, or hum sab hain hi Adam aur Hawa ki santan, so there's all of that. And then people began saying, such? Really? Is that quite correct? Has anybody taken a careful look at the data? And people began taking a careful look at the data. Parallelly, people began doing genetic sequencing, gene sequencing from non-human species. This is as different as you can get, completely different. Something like we are Homo sapiens in formal nomenclature terms, the Neanderthals are Homo neanderthalensis. So Neanderthal DNA was sequenced. And then somebody went and said, यार कह रहे हैं कि if you look at human genome sequences, more than 90% of the human genome sequence shows evidence of having come out of Africa, and therefore, we're all one lineage that has come out of Africa. And then people began looking at sequences a little more carefully, and it turns out कि हम में निएंडरथाल जीन्स भी हैं. Consider the kind of problems to the idea of species unity, species homogeneity that this creates. Because it says effectively, as one interpretative explanation, that we, as one species, have crossbred at some point in our ancient evolutionary history with another species. What happened to unity? What happened to homogeneity? And what happens to these great biological myths that are written in stone in public discourse? This is not simply true of the Neanderthals. This is true of other non-human homo lineages such as the Denisovans, for example, who are, well, as far as anybody can tell, they were far closer relatives of the Neanderthals than of Homo sapiens. The bottom line in all of this is the clear divisions of species diversity between species and unity and homogeneity within species is not as clear cut as that. And surely the old gentleman with a much longer beard, Darwin, knew this perfectly well. Because he suggested, or at least the explanation that he suggested has grown to a very interesting perspective of what diversity and unity might mean in biological terms, which is that we generate a random diversity amongst ourselves, and then from random diversity, and I'm going to use a phrase that I absolutely hate, by survival of the fittest, please see quotation marks around the phrase, survival of the fittest, very, very good people come to populate the earth. Right? This is a fairly common notion around. तो पहली बात ये है कि डार्विन ने ऐसा कुछ नहीं कहा, लेकिन भैया डार्विन साहब को मर के does anybody remember कितने साल हो गए? काफी साल हो गए. तो पुरानी बातें क्यों निकालें? Let us simply say that the reality is we have no idea of what fitness means. We really don't. As a matter of fact, what we think of as fitness is simply a matter of local contingent circumstances. उस वक्त क्या है, उस वक्त कैसे. तो इसके लिए एक उदाहरण, मैं तो यूनिवर्सिटी में नहीं पढ़ा, मैं मेडिकल कॉलेज में गया. तो जब मेडिकल कॉलेज में हम गए, मेडिकल कॉलेज में तो कोई बहस नहीं सिखाता, मेडिकल कॉलेज में याद करना पड़ता है. तो वो बात छोड़. तो मेडिकल कॉलेज में when I was in medical college, which is now like 40 years back, pretty much so when I was in medical college, there was a major problem with typhoid fever. Everybody's heard of typhoid fever. There was a major problem with typhoid fever. एक एंटीबायोटिक था जो हमारे सीनियर्स के जमाने में काफी अच्छा काम करता था. कहते थे क्लोराम्फेनिकोल, क्लोरोमाइसिटिन दे दो, बस काम कर जाएगा. और काम करता था, जहां तक हो सकता है काम करता था. But by the time we were senior medical students, it became very apparent that the new strains of the bacterium जो microbe है typhoid fever को, what am I missing in English? Which generates typhoid fever. So that microbe had become resistant to chloramicin. Everybody's heard of antibiotic resistance. So the microbe had become resistant to chloramicin. So there was a general opinion amongst physicians कि अब chloramicin नहीं दे दो भैया क्योंकि काम नहीं करता. As a result, what happened? Slowly, but over years, people stopped using chloramicin. No surprise. Now you would think that if an organism, if a bacterium has become resistant to chloromycetin, and that is why in a community which is getting typhoid fever and is transmitting typhoid fever, we are our waste disposal systems are what they are, and therefore we tend to spread this stuff, because we don't deal with public health in an effective fashion. But the organism has become resistant to chlorine. उसकी फिटनेस बढ़ गई, ठीक है ना? सब माने कि उसकी फिटनेस बढ़ गई. It has now become, because it has competed and it has survived. जब बाकी सब मर गए, लेकिन इसकी फिटनेस बढ़ी. तो इसकी फिटनेस बढ़ी तो अनादिकाल तक इसकी फिटनेस बढ़ी रहनी चाहिए ना. 10 साल पहले जब लोग देखने लगे कि एंटीबायोटिक रेजिस्टेंस की प्रोफाइल क्या है, आजकल के जो टाइफाइड फीवर के बैक्टीरिया हैं उनकी, तो उनमें से कई सारे क्लोरोमाइसिटिन को सेंसिटिव हैं. ये कैसे हो गया? If fitness increases as an absolute value, remember what we keep doing. This is why I'm saying we make these transitions from tentative ideas that are contingent in the natural sciences into broad brush mythologies in public discourse. So has fitness increased in some global value term? Not at all. All that happened was उस वक्त काफी एंटीबायोटिक इधर उधर था, तो जो रेजिस्टेंट था वो बढ़ा. बट इन ऑर्डर टू बी रेजिस्टेंट टू द एंटीबायोटिक, बेचारे बैक्टीरिया को भी कुछ काम करना पड़ा ना. इट हैड टू मेक समथिंग दैट वुड अलाउ इट टू बिकम रेजिस्टेंट. वो जो कुछ बना रहा था, व्हाटएवर प्रोटीन द बैक्टीरियम वाज मेकिंग, व्हाटएवर he is a good term to use for bacteria. Whatever he was making, or whatever the species, whatever the population was making for protecting itself against an antibiotic, was a great advantage when the antibiotic was there. But it became a great drag when the antibiotic is not there. क्योंकि वो तो बनाया जा रहा है, बाहर एंटीबायोटिक है ही नहीं बिटवा, है ना? तो उसके जो प्रतिस्पर्धी हैं, उनका काम 50 प्रोटीन बना के चल जा रहा है, ये 51वां भी बना रहा है. तो जब ज्यादा बना रहा है तो ज्यादा खाना पड़ेगा, और जब ये होता है तो in competitive terms you now have the situation that the resistant bacterium is less fit. The ideas of survival of the fittest are this extraordinarily plastic and contingent on circumstances. This is a major issue, and as I said, I'm purely for perverse reasons not going to use ordinary, regular examples of diversity. I'm going to use other examples. So let me give you another example. कहते हैं, especially in my field, मैं immunology में काम करता हूँ, यानी कि प्रतिरक्षा विज्ञान में काम करता हूँ. I and my colleagues work on how the body, human body, is what we are interested in, but we use other kinds of models as well. How the body protects itself, right? Straightforward. And every time, this is absolutely classic. Every time people in my field, my discipline, begin to talk about immune response, the analogy drawn is of war. It's a very, क्या कहते हैं, just war doctrine. Everybody's heard this? So it's a very just war doctrine kind of argument made by now. The argument is the body fights a defensive war, because the body is attempting to protect its unity and integrity. Everybody's heard this terminology. And since all of us are here, each one of us at this point in time have at least won the battle, right? That's the interpretation, or at least it should be the interpretation. ये तो मंजूर है आपको? तो ये सवाल पूछें कि एक मानव शरीर ले लें ऐसे मनुष्य का कि जो मनुष्य कल्याण के लिए अपना शरीर देने को तैयार है। ध्रुव भैया हाथ ऊपर कर रहे हैं। और एवरीबडी इज फेमिलियर कि शरीर कोशिकाओं का बना हुआ है, तो बॉडी इज मेड अप ऑफ सेल्स। तो अपन ये करें, नेवर माइंड हाउ, अपन ये करें कि यू वी डिसअसेंबल प्रोफेसर ध्रुव रायना's बॉडी इनटू इट्स कॉम्पोजिट सेल्स, पूरे जैसे हैं वैसे ले लें एंड कलेक्ट सेल्स। योर एक्सपेक्टेशन इज दैट every cell in that test tube full of formerly Dhruv Raina cells will consist of Dhruv Raina's cell, correct? That's obvious. More than half of those cells are not his cells at all. More than half of those cells are bacteria. Because your body, half the cell count in your body is actually bacteria. Yeah. You can debate कि exactly half है, कोई कहता है 30% है, कोई कहता है 70% है, यार काफी बैक्टीरिया है, ठीक है ना? If we have been fighting this immune response war in order to protect the sovereign territorial unity and integrity of our body, what are these bacteria doing in Dhruv Raina's test tube? So it turns out that immune responses don't actually function like that. Do they kill bacteria? Sure. Do they quite frequently not kill bacteria? Sure. How do they decide?
5.5.
That's a career. Trying to figure out how they decide. But zahir hai, when half the cells in your body are not your own, there is something wrong with the simplified notion of immune response as defensive war. And as I was saying this, I was wondering whether I need to underline the implications of this, but I clearly don't. So I will simply go on telling you the story for a few more minutes. अब ये पूछेगा कि this is a diversity. In your body, this is a diversity. Is this simply a diversity that we tolerate? है ना? Is this simply a diversity that we tolerate? तो प्रयोग किया जा सकता है। प्रयोग क्या है? अब इंसान को लेना तो मुश्किल है, लेकिन चूहे को ले सकते, और चूहा ले लो और पूरी चूहे की नस्ल स्टेराइल बबल में रखो. So effectively what you are doing is, by virtue of engineering technology, you make a germ free, microbe free environment.